Today I'm talking to Dr. Akil Palanisamy, who's a family physician trained at Harvard, UC San Francisco, and Stanford. He's an expert in integrative and functional medicine and Ayurveda, so he has a broad lens for understanding what drives and improves autoimmunity and MS. I love his science-backed T.I.G.E.R protocol that's coming out in his new book that's going to give you a clear roadmap to begin undoing the factors that drive MS. This is the big missing piece in your MS care, so listen in to find out how you can use these must-have tools to improve your MS symptoms. Dr. Akil Palanisamy, I am so excited to have you here with me today because we have mutual friends, we've had fun conversations, and you and I have a lot of overlap in the type of medicine we practice. So you started out in family practice and have added on a lot of other lenses like integrative medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda. So I love that you have this really broad lens to look at health and to look at disease.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Susan. It's been my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk to you about your book that's coming out.
Yep.
Because I was fascinated by your first book, Paleovedic, which is right over here. Look, it's falling apart.
Oh,
okay.
Because
I'm always looking at it.
Okay.
I loved reading this book. It just inspired so much fascination with nutrition and food and nature and how all of these molecules interact with our bodies. You have so much like easy to digest, fun, fascinating information about different foods in there. And not to mention the amazing recipes. So I'm really excited about your new book that's coming out. So I wanted to talk to you about what it takes to work on an autoimmune process and try to improve that. So can you tell me a little bit about why you wanted to write this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that with my interest in integrative medicine, it kind of naturally arose in my practice where I started to organically see a lot of patients with autoimmune disease. And as you know, in conventional medicine, the treatments like steroids or immunosuppressants, they often have side effects and they're effective, but my patients were really hungry for more natural alternatives. Often they were told by their rheumatologist or other specialists that diet doesn't matter, you can eat whatever you want. And that would conflict with their own experience where they found foods made a difference. And so a lot of these natural strategies came in response to what my patients were seeking.
There's such a big need for providing information in this area that's evidence-based and effective, because we're really not getting it from our conventional doctors. And I think that much of that reasoning is because it's not part of our training. I had to go learn it when I got a diagnosis of MS. So, so I appreciate the perspective that you bring. As someone living with MS, and I work with a lot of patients with MS, something I'm thinking about all the time. And so you've developed a really interesting protocol that is actually very comprehensive and encompasses a lot of what someone with autoimmunity needs to think about. Do you want to tell us about that?
Basically, I tried to combine it into these 5 steps in the T.I.G.E.R protocol. And the T.I.G.E.R is an acronym, and each of the letters stands for one of the key root causes for autoimmune disease. So T is toxins, I is infections, G is gut health, E is eating right, and R is rest and the mind-body connection. And I found that all 5 of these are vitally important for autoimmunity. So that's why I've included them in the protocol.
And I think when you go through that list, and as people are listening, none of those things are really a surprise, maybe with the exception of toxins. That is often new to people. But and infections, we're more and more becoming aware of the role of infections. But there's the difference between knowing the information and implementing it. And I think I'm so happy to see more and more people being interested to think about what else they can be doing in addition to what they're doing with their rheumatologists, neurologists, and other specialists.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because I think that the whole goal, like I think that you and I are trying to empower people and empower our patients to have actionable information that they can implement in their own life, because that itself is very positive to have that sense of empowerment.
Right. And what I love a lot about what you teach is that it's accessible. Much of it is not costly. And these are things you can do for yourself. It doesn't require you to go and hire an expensive professional to coach you through it. So can we break down the protocol and maybe kind of go through it one by one so people can get a flavor for what this encompasses? So T is for toxins.
Yeah.
Tell us about some of the data behind how toxins are implicated in the development of an autoimmune disease like MS.
Yeah. There are actually 20 different toxins that I review, which have an associated increased risk of autoimmunity. A lot of them are not well known. I think the topic of heavy metals may be more well known. There is some data in MS patients that they tend to have higher blood levels of arsenic, which is one of the heavy metals, and then mercury as well, which is a very common in seafood and fish. And so I think those high levels have been associated with MS, and there are case reports of people with MS who've experienced remission as a result of doing more detox. And so I think that's why I really emphasize that.
This is really important, and I think it's an area that's really not given proper attention to. Just this last week, I was talking to somebody about the role of toxins in chronic disease and MS. And their response to me was that I'm operating outside of science, basically. And the reason is I think this information is there. We're just not talking about it. So I so appreciate bringing this in. What are some strategies to help minimize the impact of toxins on our nervous system?
Yeah. So I think a few basic areas. One is hydration. I think a lot of us are dehydrated, and water is critical to detox. So making sure you're very well hydrated. Second is digestion and elimination. That's the main way our body clears toxins. So making sure that your digestion is good, you're having regular bowel movements, not having constipation. And then in terms of other foods that support detox, supporting the liver is the main focus with the diet. So the cruciferous vegetables like the broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, those are great for supporting the liver. And I also really like beet greens, which are the leafy tops of the beetroot, which very high in betaine, and that supports methylation, which is an important detox pathway. So those are some of the foods that I think are, very powerful. And then I am a big fan of the sauna, whether it's a steam sauna or infrared sauna. Studies show that does lead to significant excretion of all kinds of heavy metals and toxins through the sweat, which is not the same as the sweating from exercise. So they've actually compared that in studies, and the sweating from an external heat source like a sauna is qualitatively different, and there's different toxins produced. Both are good, of course. I'm a big fan of exercise, but the sauna has really unique benefits for autoimmunity.
Right. And this is, I know a lot of people listening with MS can't tolerate heat.
Yeah.
So again, I always tell people it's just one tool. And if that doesn't work for you, there are so many other tools, but if it is something that you can utilize, it's really beneficial. Okay, so that's toxins.
Yeah.
How about infections? There's a lot of data coming out on EBV, but we can also talk about candida and yeast. So what do you talk about in your book in regards to that?
Yeah, so there's quite a few categories of infections. And so with MS, a couple that are very notable in the literature are viruses, especially Epstein-Barr virus. That seems to be a requirement for MS because it does not appear to develop in people who are negative to EBV. And also there's this molecular mimicry that goes on, because what that is when your immune system makes antibodies, which are the proteins that bind to infections or viruses, sometimes they can cross-react with your own body tissues. And that's one of the key mechanisms for autoimmunity. So with MS, the Epstein-Barr virus antibody actually cross-reacts with the myelin protein in the nerves. And that's why one of the causes of the attack on nerves in MS is that molecular mimicry, we call it. So I think, addressing that, helping strengthen the immune system is very good. And then, you mentioned Candida as well, which is a great, it's a big topic, but there are studies showing that patients with MS are much more likely to be positive for several different Candida species than healthy controls. And then a study also showed that the type of Candida that people with MS tend to carry is more virulent. It produces more enzymes that invade the tissue and are more harmful. So both of those have been implicated in MS.
So what's your approach with targeting infections that may be driving an MS process?
Yeah, so from the diet point of view, I think eliminating sugar, like refined white sugar and processed sugar, those are the things that feed Candida. They feed bad bacteria and pathogens. So I think that's one thing I recommend avoiding in terms of the diet. And I'm a big fan of using spices for their antimicrobial effect. So I encourage people to add a lot more of a variety of spices like turmeric, which is known as an anti-inflammatory, but it actually is very good against infections and extremely safe. Also a fan of ginger and cinnamon. And then I'll also mention black cumin. So that's one that is a little bit less well-known, can be found in Asian grocery stores, but black cumin actually has good research in autoimmune disease to help with reducing inflammation, reducing autoimmune antibodies even. And that's another spice you can just use in your cooking.
Beautiful. I love that you weave in food because it's so accessible. And anytime you use a spice or food as a medicine, you're getting all the other wonderful molecules and nutrients along with it. So should people consider taking supplements or even herbal antibiotics or antifungals, antivirals?
Yeah, I think that can also be used. So in the supplement world, I actually like the research behind curcumin, which is the extract of turmeric, because that has been shown to be in a couple of studies equivalent to prescription strength anti-inflammatory drugs. So you get that reduction in inflammation, and you have pretty good antimicrobial, antiviral, antibacterial properties, which are not well known for curcumin, but it's in the literature and it's very beneficial as well.
Yeah, the more we can get these amazing molecules in our diet, just the better we're going to set up our cellular health to our bodies inhospitable to some of these bugs. And speaking of making things inhospitable, let's talk about gut health, because that's the G of T.I.G.E.R. How do you approach gut health?
Yeah, I think gut is very fundamental because 70% of your immune cells are located in the gut, in the associated lymph tissue. And so most of your immune system actually is in the gut and affected by the microbiome, which is all the gut bacteria. And so in autoimmune disease, there are three main findings that are consistent across the board with different autoimmune conditions. One is a reduction in diversity. So we know that the diversity of your microbiome is one of the most important barometers for health. And when that drops, that is problematic. Second is dysbiosis, which basically means a decline in good bacteria and rise in overgrowth of either bacteria, yeast, fungi, and a basic sense of imbalance. So when that ecosystem goes through dysbiosis, that's another thing that is problematic. And then the final thing is increased intestinal permeability, which is known to many people as leaky gut syndrome. And there are now hundreds of research papers supporting that this is a real finding, and also one of the earliest findings in autoimmunity, because the autoimmune process can occur over 10, 20 years. And sometimes the intestinal permeability is one of the first things to change even before symptoms appear.
So if we had to break it down, can you come up with maybe 2 or 3 highly effective things we can do to start improving our gut health?
Yes. So I'm a big fan of fermented foods. So studies show that increasing intake of fermented foods lowers inflammation, reduces like blood markers of inflammation, and also boosts the diversity of the microbiome, which is one of those key metrics in autoimmunity. So I think getting a variety of fermented foods. If you can't tolerate dairy, there's sauerkraut, there's coconut kefir, there's kimchi. A lot of non-dairy options are out there. And then second, I am still a fan of bone broth, which I talk about in my first book. And even though it's kind of a fad now, I think bone broth does have good research to the use of it with the gelatin and the amino acids and other compounds that are healing the gut permeability. So that's specific for the leaky gut component.
Yeah, it's actually one of the most potent things to help clean up that lining and get it repaired. So I like that you have a balanced approach. You are a big proponent of plants, and I think
Yes.
you personally yourself, are you vegan or vegetarian?
No, but I'm plant-based. I do incorporate like animal protein, but I agree. Yeah, plant foods are the main support for the microbiome. So that's what I emphasize.
And we know research shows that one of the best ways to start diversifying your microbiome is to start eating a diversity of foods, right? So I always talk to my patients about getting in at least 50 ingredients a week as a starting point, because there are people who are eating 10 ingredients a week, right?
Yes.
And that means your microbiome is going to shrink down to just a few species. So
yes. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, because every different type of fiber in a different plant feeds a different kind of bacteria. So the more variety you have in your diet, the more different species of bacteria you're feeding. And it's always good to try to vary the diet, get vegetables or fruits you don't normally eat, and be kind of experimenting with that. And plus, it's often a great way to make your diet more interesting and tasty.
for sure. I take my kids to the farmer's market, and they are allowed to buy any vegetable that is organic, and we don't have to know what it is. We'll come home and figure it out after we Google it. But it's introduced new foods to us that we otherwise wouldn't have tried. So what's your stance on supplements for prebiotics and probiotics?
Yeah, they can be potentially very effective. I think with prebiotics, I actually like psyllium husk, which is a basic. It's found in like Metamucil, but you can also get it separately without the colors or sweeteners as just psyllium husk. And that's a prebiotic that actually has been shown to support some of the beneficial bacteria in the gut, raise levels of what are called short chain fatty acids, which are these metabolites that are anti-inflammatory that are produced by the gut bacteria, and getting the right prebiotics can help with feeding them. And then with probiotics as well, huge field. I think that I always emphasize starting with the probiotic foods, which are all the fermented foods that have the live cultures. And then if you still have gut issues, maybe working with a practitioner to choose the right probiotic.
Right. Yeah, it's about sort of looking at all your tools and figuring out what works best.
Mhm.
Okay, moving on to the E of T.I.G.E.R, which is eat right. Tell us about some of your recommendations there.
Yeah, so with the diet, studies have shown that in patients with MS, they're a little more likely to have antibodies against dairy, antibodies against gluten. And so the two kind of that I recommend focusing on are cutting back on gluten and dairy in terms of potentially inflammatory foods for some people, and then increasing the prebiotic foods. So there are actually a lot of prebiotic foods. So in the book, I go through like all the different categories of prebiotics, like polyphenols, resistant starch. There's 3 types of resistant starch. There's arabinogalactans. There's other prebiotic foods. And so I go through like dozens of foods for each of those prebiotic categories to give people choices. They don't need to eat all of them, but they can choose the ones they want to try, and that way boost the diversity of their gut microbiome.
I love that because people have access to different foods based on where they live. They also have different cultural preferences, different cooking skills. So it's always important to see the menu and then you can pick and choose. But we as patients can actually personalize our diet for ourselves. We don't need a health coach or a nutritionist to do that for us. We just need curiosity and a willingness to try something new. So, okay. And then the final letter is the R, and this is the rest and rebalance. I might say this might be the hardest.
Yes. Yes, that's true. Yeah, because often, we feel overwhelmed when we're trying to add one more thing to our routine, even if it's a stress reduction technique. So I think the key thing is we know stress plays a role in autoimmunity, and keeping stress low leads to lower risk of relapse and, flare-ups. And that can be many different forms. It could be counseling or psychotherapy. It could be your exercise routine is meditative for you. Could be yoga or Tai Chi, movement-based approaches. And then if you are drawn to those mind-body techniques like meditation or guided imagery, those are also very effective ways. So finding what works for you in terms of reducing your stress and improving that mind-body connection is what I recommend.
Yeah. And again, I think it's really important to have the menu of options, because how often do we hear from our patients, oh, I can't meditate. I don't know how to sit still for 40 minutes.
Yes.
Nobody has to sit still for 40 minutes. For me, I'm a fidgety person. I got to go on my treadmill and pound it out, on the treadmills. And that's meditation for me, even though someone a long time ago told me that doesn't count. I get to choose. It does count.
Right. It does.
But, there are still practitioners out there who don't talk to patients with MS about the connection between stress and the onset and progression of MS. And it's such an important connection, and one that if we start addressing, we can actually start to make real progress. And I can tell you, as somebody with living with MS, when I get into a stressful situation, the weakness in this left arm gets worse immediately within 30 to 60 seconds. So I've got like a built-in stress meter in my left arm. So I can tell you from personal experience that connection is there. So so you provide a lot of really fun and interesting information that's actionable. Is there actually like a protocol or a program to kind of for someone to follow? Because I haven't read your book yet. It's not out yet. So tell us about what someone can expect when they get your book.
Absolutely. Yes. So what I've tried to do in the second half of the book is talk about how to implement the T.I.G.E.R protocol, and then go through each of those categories like toxins, infections, gut, and the diet and stress, and then start adding in foods that help each of those steps, and also spices, potentially certain supplements, and lifestyle practices like exercise and sauna. And so I definitely believe that's crucial, because people need to know the practical kind of day-to-day, what do I need to do today? And so I will kind of walk people through that in terms of the 5 steps of the protocol.
And do you have to go through the steps in order, or how does somebody
Yes.
choose?
Yeah, I do recommend that. And the reason is that the order makes a difference. So when you start with detoxifying and reducing overall toxic load in your body, that actually makes it easier to clear infections, because sometimes when you're clearing infections, there's die-off, which can contribute to kind of toxic symptoms if you're already very high in toxins. And so I think that's why toxins come first. And then why infections come second is, before you work on healing your gut and the leaky gut, you want to try to reduce levels of bad bugs. And that makes it more effective to heal the gut. So reducing levels of candida, bad bacteria and yeast and viruses, all of that helps you in the third phase, which is gut healing. And then with stress, I do think you're right. It's very challenging for people to think about how to work in that area, but I find it more effective when people are already working on detox and their diets to then see the benefits of a stress reduction practice.
I agree with you. It's hard to take your stress from here to here when there's nothing else in place to support you.
Right.
So that's actually a really nice cadence. And how long do you think it would take someone to go through the protocol? Is it on the order of weeks or months?
Yeah, I lay out like about a 3-month plan. So I think because we're using natural strategies, it's not going to be overnight like taking a drug. And so I recommend people stick with at least the full 3 months to see the benefits.
Beautiful. And what is the most challenging part of working with this protocol, so that people can problem solve and try to get through it better?
Yeah, I find that for most people, the hardest area is that mind, body, and stress connection, because there was actually a study which showed that this was in a highly stressed population of caregivers, but when they were asked to do a daily, mind, body meditation, they actually had increased levels of stress and anxiety, because they're already very overwhelmed, and it was like you're adding another task to their to-do list. So that's an example of how it can be very challenging and so I think that like you said, like having that menu of different options is really helpful, and people can know that whatever they choose, whether it be journaling or prayer or counseling or exercise or meditation, that any of those tools are like valid avenues to addressing your stress.
For sure. And I always tell my patients, start small and schedule it. So I often tell people, just start with 1 minute of meditation, maybe when you wake up. Like, everybody has 1 minute. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And as things start feeling better, you'll eventually just want to add on to it anyways.
Right.
So one other thing that we need to talk about, as we were talking about the T.I.G.E.R acronym, but we have talked about fasting together, and this is something both you and I do personally. Can you tell us a little bit about how fasting can help autoimmunity, and what are some of the data with MS?
Yeah, absolutely. I think fasting has been shown to really help modulating the immune system, and that's where the benefit is for autoimmunity. So there was a study, small study, 15 MS patients who went through intermittent fasting for about 2 weeks. And what that entailed was they were asked to have a low-calorie day alternating with a regular diet day. And on the low-calorie days, they would just have 500 calories of total food. So maybe like 2 salads over the course of a day. So they weren't skipping meals completely. They were just eating a low-calorie day, alternating with a regular day. And the study was interesting because even with 15 days, at the end of that, they found significant differences in immune function. So they measured the number of these cells called T regulatory cells, which are like the peacekeepers for the immune system. And they were higher in those who had done the fasting. And then they also tested the function of their cells. So they found that the ones who were fasting, their T regulatory cells were stronger, had more suppressive activity against inflammation. And so you're increasing the number and also improving the function of your immune cells. And I think intermittent fasting is a great tool for that.
I think fasting is a game changer in that it changes our relationship to eating.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I know I was an overeater until I started thinking about putting less food in my GI tract less often.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just completely changed how my brain works now throughout the day. I'm not constantly seeking food. And knowing this data that you just presented helps me stick with it.
Yes.
And the beautiful thing about our, putting in place good behaviors, like fasting, one of them, is that fasting, just that one act of fasting broadly affects your physiology, your biochemistry, genetics and which genes are turned on and off. And so it has this really broad effect on cleaning up your cellular health.
Yes.
So it's and that there's so many different fasting regimens out there that people can experiment with. Now, I always say, if you have unstable blood sugars, high blood sugars, low blood sugars, or you're on medications, please talk to someone, a healthcare provider before fasting, because we don't want to bottom out your blood sugars. But there are very easy to start fasting regimens. Like, I love the overnight fasting.
Yes.
Is pretty easy to do. And some of us are already doing 12 hours between dinner and breakfast.
Right.
So again, these are just really powerful tools that make an impact. And I always say this is the big missing piece of MS care. We just have to start bringing these things in so that our patients can make more progress faster, because time is brain.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, putting this all together for people with autoimmunity, people with MS, I think can be a real game changer.
And what you talk about is root cause approaches. So you can write a book creating a protocol for autoimmunity, and that works for MS and rheumatoid arthritis and Sjogren's and so on, because we're really working at that foundational level, just trying to clean things up. So it's an approach that's really important. So tell us, when does your book come out? How do we get our hands on it?
So it's coming out on May 9th, and it's available for pre-order, like on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And I've put together a list of bonuses, which for people who pre-order, which is available through my website, drakil.com, which is DOCTORAKIL.com. So if you pre-order, then you can get access to those bonuses, like over $1,000 worth of discounts on all kinds of different products and courses.
Perfect. So please go check out Dr. Akil's website. And you can also find him on Facebook and Instagram, which is another way to connect and get real evidence-based information. Okay, so we are excited to get our hands on your book and to learn more. And thank you so much for always just bringing in really interesting information and getting us interested in learning more about the foods we eat and the behaviors we put into practice.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Susan, for having me on, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. It was lovely to have you.